This is Alexandru Constantine, and you are listening to the Dicenius Review, where we discuss novels, film, art, and culture from a perspective outside the mainstream. The review is a Substack podcast, but you can listen to us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, and anywhere else via RSS. If you enjoy the show, please hop on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify and like, follow, and share this episode. That kind of stuff does improve our visibility, and, that matters in this day and age. Anyways, good morning. We are recording this episode on Friday the 24th on another beautiful low country morning. This is the 10th episode of the podcast, and I have to admit that this project has exceeded my expectations. The quality of conversation I've had with my guests has been intelligent and interesting. Most of all, I've had a great time enjoying a cup of coffee and talking about subjects that really interest me. Now, in our sphere, that is, the common internet, Substack specifically, there's been a bit of back and forth between some factions, which includes several past guests. For the most part, my interests lie in the literature, publishing, art, and culture. Politics bore me, and I find the discussion of religion to be best when personal and intimate. But I did step in and have a discussion with Walt Bismarck about AI art, something that I have strong feelings about. Either way, the point of me bringing this up is that I envision this podcast as a cafe, a place where people can sit down and have conversation over a cup of coffee without feelings being hurt and without accusations thrown around. Due to this, I welcome anyone that wishes to have a conversation about any topic outside of the typical mainstream, as long, and this is key guys, okay, as long as there is an element of art and culture to it. For example, right now, I would love to have David Green, a YouTuber who I've listened to for years and respect very much as a thinker, come on. So Dave, or fans of Dave, consider this an invitation. I think we would have a lot to talk about. Now, with that out of the way, I want to introduce my guest today, the editor of Pilum Press, Neal Durando. If you've listened to previous episodes, you know that I am a super serious supporter of Pilum Press, specifically the Pilum author J.B. Jackson, who was a guest on the pod several weeks ago. So having Neal, the founder and editor, is a great honor. Hey, good morning, Neal, or should I say good afternoon because you're in France?
Yeah, it's the afternoon, but it's also glorious over here.
Right, and is it beautiful spring in France, or?
It is magnificent in France at this time of year. I highly suggest that you leave where you are now and come here.
Right. You know what? I feel like Europe is at its best in late spring, just overall. At least Romania was when I visited last year. I thought late spring, just late May was just beautiful. The weather was perfect.
Well, I've only been east once, and it was to Hungary. And it was very hot. So continental weather is completely different from what we have here. I'm in Western France, so we usually get rain on the tides.
Okay, that makes sense. A lot more
But
coastal.
it means it's very, very lush.
Well, I'm in South Carolina, and we have these beautiful sunny mornings. Then horrendous thunderstorms with tornado warnings, and then the sun comes out again. So it's random, but we do have some of the most beautiful like sunsets and sunrises I've ever seen. And I moved here from Southern California, which has amazing sunsets. But you know what? Here we are, old men talking about weather. Let's talk about Pilum, okay? So you are the founder and editor, I guess editor in chief, if you had more than one editor, right? Of Pilum Press.
We're getting there. We're taking on freelancers here and there, and I hope that if we ever, I'm trying to build this to last longer than myself. So at an appropriate moment, I'll flip the keys over to someone else. But with a few years down the line, if we had some institutional money, we could probably take on another editor, especially if we added an imprint. And then I would indeed be an editor in chief. But right now, I'm the public face of Pilum, which is a loosely associated group of publishing professionals that help us.
Right. Well, I mean, based on the output from Pilum, which is not heavy on volume, but definitely high on quality. I mean, Shag Duck, and I've had the pleasure of reading the follow-up, Ursula of Ulm, and I'm a tremendous fan of Sky Heronstrom. The output is fantastic, and if Pilum continues to put out authors like J.B. Jackson, then I see great independent fiction coming my way for the foreseeable future. I do. So let's talk about you first before we go into Pilum. Like, why don't you give my listeners a quick background on yourself? I know you have a previous past in the publishing industry, a writer yourself. So how did this all come about?
Uh, Pilum, or you're asking about my earlier career?
A little both. A little both.
Well, okay. I entered publishing in 1990, late 1990. I worked for Gordon Lish at Knopf for 2.5 years, and then worked at Harcourt Brace for Anne Friedgood for a similar span of time. Then I left editorial. I stopped doing editorial work, except, I did lots of freelance copy editing, and I learned a bit about production. I did a year of graphic design work, school work, and then worked as a layout production person for a few years. Then I left New York in 95. I went to St. Louis to the Washington University creative writing program. Terrible error. And persisted there until they gave up and gave me a degree to get me out of there. Thence I went to Chicago, where I worked as a production editor in a think tank there. And from there, it was over to France in 2001.
Okay.
So that brings us up to France.
Right. Well, and that's interesting because this makes you one of the only people I've had so far on the podcast that has history in professional, actual, traditional publishing, which is fascinating. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be fascinating for a lot of my listeners because they're all independent publishers themselves, or independent writers and independent musicians. And having somebody that has a past on the inside is, I find that fascinating because I find the industry fascinating, or the lack of industry right now, or how it's changed since I started reading.
Well, the inside is the outside right now. So that's the thing you've got to know, that,
right.
It's been turned inside out. So it's, what the inside looks like now, I'm completely distant from that. I don't know. I had some instincts about it, but, I can talk about what, how books were published back in the day. I don't think it's really changed all that much, to tell you the truth.
And then maybe that's the problem, that it hasn't really changed, or it's hard to say based on being an outsider.
There's too much that's made of that distinction between insider and outsider. I mean, I've been the fly on the wall when some interesting things went down, so I know, it's a bit like seeing how the sausage is made. You really wish you hadn't seen it. And right. it gives you, I remember in graduate school that, people would ask me questions particularly about my editorial time. And I always came off as being, I didn't mean to, but I came off as being rather cynical. But I was simply describing what I saw.
Right. It's a business, right?
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate in that, particularly in the time when I worked, there was still a kind of magic envelope for literary publishing. Literary fiction is this kind of false category that came around in the 1970s, designed to push back against the corporate forces. So, you have to explain things to the bean counters, and I've got stories about that too. So an enormous amount of energy goes towards articulating just what it is you're doing with the company's money. However, traditionally, editors didn't do that. They were hired for their taste and for their contacts, and that was certainly the case with Gordon. There was a magic envelope around him because he had discovered Raymond Carver,
Right.
and so that was very easy to explain to Big Random, Random House, which was the parent company of Knopf then. Well, what I'm doing is I'm looking for the next Raymond Carver, and there you are. Everyone knew who that was, and whatever kind of crazy books that Gordon was publishing at any given time, corporate doesn't read. An astounding number of people do not read. You slap a cover on something, and so long as it sells, you're fine.
Right.
You can make whatever claims you want about its merit, and in a way, it doesn't matter internally. Which explains the pageant of New York, because there's a lot of elbowing that goes on to secure a proper curatorial judgment. And back in the day, that was Michiko Kakutani at the New York Times.
Right. That's so just a quick aside for listeners. When Neal mentions Gordon, he's talking about Gordon Lish, and who he just mentioned right now was a very prominent, I think she's still writing, a prominent New York Times book reviewer.
Well, she was. I think she may no longer be with us. I'm very, very out of it, Alex.
Right.
It's going to be amusing to see where you catch me out, because
I just wanted to mention who we were talking about, just because
right, sure.
Some of the listeners might not know, and I tend to know who these people are because
Right. Well, Gordon never moved in the circles where Kakutani would ever pick up on one of his books.
Right.
I was talking about that magic envelope. We were definitely deep in that magic envelope. My second boss, Anne Friedgood, was a more traditional publisher. I had the honor of working on Harold Bloom's The Western Canon when I was there. In fact, that's why I was hired, because I already knew Harold Bloom through Gordon. And he was kind of this magnificent, impossible person to deal with. And it was better that he had familiar faces around him. So that's how I got on at Harcourt. So Anne worked with people who already had cultural recognition, whereas Gordon was trying to launch people into the culture. It was fascinating to watch him do that. I mean, and it's fascinating to see on the other side of, goodness, 30 years now, who is known and who is not. I mean, it's fascinating and it's tragic, because it's wonderful, for example, that Walter Kern has built out from his initial collection of short stories. And he's wonderful to hear him talk about that. Walter was one of the few people whose head did not get completely spun around by Gordon. I think he described the experience in an interview where he said he characterized Gordon as someone who thought short stories were much more important than, who was fascinated with short stories for some mysterious reason. Kern is of course a smart guy, and he knows that novels are where it's at when it comes to fiction writing.
Right.
And he was never confused about that. But And anyway,
Well, to talk about mention Walter Kern real fast, he's a great example of somebody from I would guess your generation or that era of the '90s that is very prominent today in like alternative, more dissident literary circles. He came on the scene, I think, after he did that interview with Bret Easton Ellis, and he started doing a lot of appearances on the Bret Easton Ellis podcast. And then he hit the Twitter hard, and he, I guess, amassed tons of followers on there. He was a pretty prominent Twitterer. Now he moved to Substack, and he's doing that podcast, and he put out that like print newspaper thing, and he's kind of made a space for himself in a very like independent, kind of a broken away from the mainstream publishing world, which is, to me, I find the whole thing fascinating that these, heavyweights from back in the day, or these guys are coming in and kind of turning their back on, the New York element of it and focusing more on.
well, I don't know that. I don't think that Walter's turned his back on the New York
Yeah, I don't think so either.
was-
But they're bringing in people that otherwise would not get the kind of people that listen to Walter stuff for the most part, or follow him on Twitter, are not the kind of people that walk into Barnes and Noble and pick up a book from the bestseller list. They tend to be guys that like will
Well, I'm not that sort of person either. But,
right. I mean, is anybody who does that? Who even though it's always packed. All right, Barnes and Noble out here is always packed. All right, like even in the deep South here in South Carolina, it's always packed, and we have a significantly like large bookstore, like several bookstores that are actually quite fantastic. And there seems to be kind of and this is of course all my own perception, but there seems to be a large little like outburst of book clubs that are forming around here. Like at my work, I've got like there's 4 book clubs of people.
I really there needs to be a term for this that's a bit like scientism,
Right.
where people value science for ideological reasons, but not for scientific ones.
Right.
I think it's got to be literaryism or something. I don't think that much is getting read. I think a lot is being consumed. There's a lot that's purchased.
Right.
I heard you on your previous podcast saying that reading groups are quite robust in South Carolina, and that your wife is in a group where they're reading big fantasy novels and whatnot. And my reaction to that is not that that it's not reading; it's that literacy has changed. And
Right.
I saw this when I was in Chicago. I remember I used to take the L downtown, and it would go through some good neighborhoods, and so I would see the professional people getting on. And back then, 1999, 2000, what I saw was adults reading Harry Potter, and I couldn't figure out why. I mean, I should have just asked someone. I mean, now I'm not as shy. I would have simply engaged someone to explain why they're reading juvenile literature. There's a kind of at that time there was a kind of indifference to what one was doing. I mean, there were no smartphones, so I prided myself on having learned the New York commuter's way of folding the New York Times such that you could read it in a very enclosed space, which I'm sure that skill is completely gone now. And so it looked unwieldy to me in Chicago that people were reading these huge fantasy books. I was so curious. I asked a professor of mine about it. I went to I had this wonderful professor named Stuart Sherman who's written many brilliant books, but the one I would recommend to you is Telling Time, which is an examination of how exact timekeeping had changed writing with Samuel Pepys's diaries. Anyway, Stuart was the smartest guy I knew about how affect is generated from style. And I remember a meeting. We met behind the main library in New York, and I just had him for an hour or so. He was going on to do something else. He was teaching at Fordham at the time. So, well, what do you think is behind this? He said, well, I don't know. The school is like this closed trope. It's very structured. It's easy to fill out. You can everyone has stories about school, so it's a common experience. So wizard school, okay, well, that's a very, but he couldn't really get at why it was so popular. And I think now that this was the beginning of a really huge decline in literacy. Already, it might have been Sven Birkitz in Harper's who had sort of sent up a flare saying, oh, serious books aren't being written anymore and men aren't reading anything but nonfiction. It was beginning to be understood that men had stopped reading fiction. Well, I think there was Stuart's explanation of course is fine, but I think what he didn't see, because he teaches graduate students all the time, people who are legitimate readers of whatever quality, but it was just a decline in literacy, and since then I think it's snowballed. There's a reason why young adult fiction is so popular with adults now.
Right.
It's because it's not difficult to read.
Right. So, this is something I think about a lot, significantly. And it's something that, I think anybody that is writing or has aspirations to write anything is that who's going to read my stuff? Who's going to read what I have to say? Now, I tend to have a very artsy viewpoint, to the point where I don't really care if anybody reads my stuff. I'm doing it because I love the act of it, right? But that does not in any way, shape, or form pay my mortgage, right? So there has to be some
Well, there's a lot of daylight between, I don't care if anybody reads it, and I've got to make money off of my writing. There's a ton of daylight there.
Right. Absolutely. You're right. But, the thought about literacy and what people are reading is something that I find very interesting, because, I'm significantly younger than you, but I'm not that young. I'm 41 years old, and I'm a heavy reader. I read one or two novels a week, and I don't read light stuff most of the time. I read some pretty heavy stuff. And that's what I enjoy doing. And I asked myself, because I have a daughter and I want her to be a reader, how do you, are readers born? Are readers nurtured? It's something I try to think about a lot, because I want to share my love of reading with my daughter, for example. And I love having conversations.
You must read aloud to her.
And that's I started reading aloud to her before she was born, basically.
Yeah, fantastic.
We do it every night, and she knows how to read right now, but she doesn't like to. I catch her reading and writing, but then as soon as I ask her to do it, she's like, no, it's too much work. And I'm like, okay. But I mean, she did that with swimming. I tried to teach her how to swim, and she refused to learn how to swim. And then she taught herself how to swim. She's diving to the bottom of the pool, and, free diving and all kinds of stuff. But she's just a stubborn creature, which is what I am too. So it makes sense. I mean, she's, my wife's, I'm Romanian and Russian, and my wife is of Irish descent. So basically it's the worst of all European traits put into one. Right. So she's going to be a vodka drinking potato farmer. But anyways, right. With a very, very serious anger problem. But I look back. So I went to public school. My dog just slammed open my door.
Oh no!
No, it's the door to my studio, which is my spare bedroom. The dog likes to hang out in here. She considers it her room, and I closed it when we started, and she pushed it open. She's like, "No way! What are you doing in here?"
Dominance games.
Yeah. Anyways, I'm a public school kid, right? I went to public school in Southern California, and I went to, what would be considered a middle class, middle upper class public school, public high school, and there was some pretty decent reading. I think
When did
like
you graduate? So around 90s.
2002. I graduated 2002.
2002. Okay, go ahead.
So in middle school, my middle school, which was very, very middle class, I remember like we were reading Great Expectations, for example. We read Tale of Two Cities in seventh grade.
Fantastic.
A lot of, yeah, and you know what? I hated it when I first read it in middle school, and then I read it recently, maybe 5 years ago, and I loved it.
Oh, the burning coal. Go back and read that metaphor that he deploys in the first
Oh
chapter.
yeah, I loved it. I was like, God, I was
Unbelievable.
like, man, this is a
Unbelievable.
masterpiece. And then I remember hating it as a, what is 12-year-old or 13-year-old or whatever. I mean, I read it, but I was a lot more into like World War II history and like spy novels in middle school.
Hmm.
I missed the Harry Potter craze. Okay, I think I was a little bit too old for Harry Potter. Harry Potter came out maybe a few years after. I was already past the reading level of Harry Potter when Harry Potter came out.
Hmm.
My wife's generation, though, like a few years younger than me, they grew up with Harry Potter. So they started reading Harry Potter like when they were age appropriate and kind of read as it went along. But I recently did read all the Harry Potters because I'm reading them with my daughter, and I
Hmm.
think they're actually really good. But they're
Oh,
not
you like it?
literature, but they're
Yeah.
good. They're good for what they
I
are.
didn't mean to run them down.
Right.
I was curious. I just thought it was a curious thing to be reading.
Right. And my question is though, like,
Because the books are big and, people have
oh, they're
briefcases
massive.
and whatnot and we're
Yeah.
going downtown at that time to work, right?
Right. They're
So
massive, right? But at the same, what's interesting is that like there is the way I felt. Okay, if I would have just focused on literature from what I was taught in high school, I would have not been a reader today whatsoever.
a lot of
Because
people say that. Yeah, a lot of people say that.
high school, at least here in where I went in Southern California, does everything in its power to make you hate reading. I don't know why they do that, or I know they do it, unintentionally, and I know the teachers are very like, specifically if you're a male, right? Because everything is very feminized and it's completely out of context. There's no like spirit into the stuff. I mean, one of the novels that you read in high school that's kind of a standard is Great Gatsby. Right?
Mhm.
And you and I have talked about this before. I think The Great Gatsby is one of the best 20th century American novels, and just that first chapter alone is some of the best written prose ever written, in my opinion.
It's
Um,
astounding. It's astounding.
but as a 15-year-old kid, The Great Gatsby is not for you. Okay.
It's very hard. What I couldn't work out at 15 was the geography of it.
Right.
And it wasn't until I lived in New York and I understood how the Hamptons worked socially.
Right.
There's no exposition really in the book that explains the geography, and that's what modernists do. That's discursive. It's secondary to what Fitzgerald is trying to build.
Right.
But it really at my level of sophistication, I probably read it at the same age you did, around 15.
Right. And
I couldn't really put it together.
I remember liking it. I remember when I first read it, I liked it. I was like, oh, this is a great novel. But I liked it as a 15-year-old. And I don't think I understood it because The Great Gatsby is a reflective book from the perspective of a mid-30s Nick,
Yeah.
looking back at all the mistakes that, Gatsby himself made. And it's the ultimate like cuck book, if you want to be honest, right? It's basically don't do that. Don't be, completely, held up on one woman that ultimately will never care about you because she cares more about status and the money of that lifestyle. It's a very anti-American dream novel, if you really want to be honest. And the way it's portrayed and the way the films
Oh,
portray.
I think that's a subsequent reading, and you went to school in California, and I went to school in Texas uh, more than a decade before you, and I think probably because I remember reading it rather well, we were the class I was in we were the first AP class through the system in Fort Worth. And so all the kids, we had been in the same class since fifth grade, essentially. So we all knew each other really well. And it's funny to think of now because I think out of those 30 kids, probably six of us have graduate degrees in something literature related, including a couple of PhDs. Anyway, the young PhDs back then, I think that what what really struck me was Nick's pining and the the idea of the sort of femininity for which he pined was really, it's like, oh God, that's some heavy stuff. We didn't see it, we didn't read it the way you did.
Right.
Um, we of course you identify with Nick, um, and you sort of want to go through that heartbreak yourself. It's a terrible thing to set kids up for, but thinking back on it now, I mean, it's the passages about the light at the end of the pier that you know that
Right.
really really
It's a
struck.
beautiful book, but you're giving it to teenage boys, right? At the,
Yeah,
at the beginning of their life, at the beginning,
right.
they're like getting ready to leave high school, go to college, and blah blah blah. And now you're telling them that no matter how hard you work, Daisy's still gonna go off with Tom.
Right,
You know what I mean?
right.
And then if you get a girlfriend like the tennis girl, I forget that character's name, Nick's girlfriend. Uh, she's just doesn't care about anything. She's a complete nihilist. Jordan,
Jordan is
right? Jordan, yeah. And it's such a book that it's such a complex, it's such a simple book.
well, the point with you didn't have a good teacher, as good a teacher as I did.
No,
The point
that's
was
true.
not it's like, well, you might not understand this, but you've got to say something about it. So what is the thing, and how are you going to deploy that in a hamburger essay?
Right. That's true. And I mean, listen, I went to school in Southern California, so a good 25% of my classes didn't speak English because they spoke only Spanish,
Right,
right? So I can't blame the teachers too much because they have to,
right.
compress it. So I think The Great Gatsby gets picked because it's a really short novel. In the same way, um, you know, Lord of the Flies gets chosen, and The Catcher in the Rye is the other one that gets taught, and that's because if you're going to get kids to read, they're going to read like really short stuff, right?
Right. Huh.
So
I,
you leave high school with this feeling, if you're not a reader yourself and you don't have a reading family, you leave high school with this feeling that uh, reading is just miserable shit, you know. And in order to read, you're supposed to read serious stuff, and it's misery. And I think that the problem is that first and foremost, reading has to be a joy. And if you don't enjoy reading and it has
oh, I
nothing to
agree with
do with you, you're never going to push past the initial stuff. Because at first, I think that the way to approach reading or teaching people how to read, or by teaching people how to read, I mean teaching people how to read literature, is that you start them off with the Harry Potters when they're young, and then you
you.
move on to the Tom Clancy's or whatever, the Stephen
Oh,
King's.
I don't know. I don't know. I think you can. I think you can challenge uh,
Right, but then
children
you
very
challenged
well.
them when you show them like this is fun, this is the good stuff. Now I grew up with a dad that was a heavy reader. I come from a family of heavy readers on my dad's side, and my grandmother was a heavy reader and have a big library growing up. And my dad would he would go out and he would come back every week or so and like, hey, here's a new book for you, like read this one. So I read a lot. I read significantly a lot of stuff. Um,
Do you read Romanian?
I read very little Romanian. When I went last year to Romania, I bought a bunch of Romanian books because I wanted to practice my Romanian reading.
Are you going to do it?
I'm trying.
Oh, do it.
I'm
You,
trying.
you
Yeah.
really, you have to. You have to.
So I actually
You
found out that just doing that has improved my own writing because it makes me. I've been kind of translating a lot of stuff from Romanian into English, and that is a great
wonderful,
exercise in understanding, the English language itself, or like
wonderful
words.
exercise. Yeah, I highly recommend it. In graduate school, I very quickly was, well, my the distaste between Washu and me was mutual and almost immediate. Um, I went there to work with Stanley Elk, and he died a week before I showed up, and it was too late for me to turn around. So um, one of the ways I occupied myself, I translated a book by an Argentine friend of mine, and it was kind of an easy translation to do, and it was too easy, and I began to be suspicious of the work I had done. So I sat down and I took equivalent passages out of Marquez and Borges, looking at Edie Grossman is the translator for Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and she is just sublime. Just I have not the choices she makes are she completely disabused me of any idea about being good at Spanish. I think I'm a little bit like you. You speak Romanian.
I do. I speak it pretty
Yeah.
well.
Um, I had an early exposure to Spanish, and I spoke it better than uh, before I learned French. But anyway, so I put myself through this exercise, and it's wonderful to, particularly if you're working in Latin languages like Romanian or Spanish or French, uh, to see the differences in the structures, particularly in syntax. You learn about the efficiency of English, and how you can use syntax to inform meaning in a much more robust way than you can in a Latin language.
Absolutely, and it's so it's so interesting because I can't say I appreciated the English language as much as I do now after trying to teach my daughter how to read and write, because it's such
Mm,
an insane language, and it's such a difficult language when you come at it from, I learned English when I was a little kid, and I learned how to read and write real fast, but
mm,
it's I learned it like naturally without actually like thinking about grammar or anything like that.
mm.
But teaching it to my daughter, I'm like, oh my God, what a complex language, because she asks questions like, why this, why that? And I'm like, I don't know. I really don't know. It's because I don't know.
So now you have some sympathy for your high school teacher.
Right, I do. It's like because English is this crazy mismatch of like Anglo-Saxon mixed with French and mixed with like a bunch of Latin words and every German
Sure.
variation thrown in, and some Dutch and just some Spanish, and it's just insane language.
That's wonderful.
But it's a great language for writing. There's a
Mm,
reason why, it's such a dominant language. And it's not just because the British colonized the world, but it's really because it is a very versatile language that allows you to say the same thing multiple ways that you can't in a language like Romanian, which tends to be a lot more straightforward and limited, which in itself is a good thing also, but I tend to prefer English.
mm.
Um, we got off let's talk
No,
about
I
language.
was curious whether
Well,
how invested
so I
in Romanian you were.
I speak Romanian. I don't speak a lot of it right now because there's nobody to speak to. But occasionally I'll run
Mm,
into a Romanian speaker in the United States, and they tend to make fun of me. They say that like, "Where are you from? Los Angeles, Romania?" Because I guess I talk like a surfer when I do try to speak Romanian. But
right.
when I went and visited last year, I just immediately just slid right into it. Like it felt so
Yeah.
natural to me, and nobody like, you know, people like I talked to, they were surprised that I spoke it so well. And I caught myself being able to read all the menus and all the signs and everything. And you got to keep in mind that I moved away. I only had 6 months of first grade education in Romania. Of course,
Mm.
in Romanian first grade, they already read novels, but that's a different thing, you know?
For those of you who don't know, Romania is a highly literate country.
Right. And there is a bookstore on every corner in Bucharest. Okay. And you know, if you walk up to the random, and this is our education problem. Okay, this is an education problem. If you walk up to the random American, you try to ask them about, you know, hey, what's your favorite Dostoevsky or Tolstoy? They have no fucking idea. And then, let's just be honest here,
Well,
right?
that's okay. I mean, that's you know, yeah, that's the coin of the realm. I mean,
Right.
it there's so many interesting things that you said, but about slipping back into habits and understanding. I feel the same way when I go to Argentina, and it's to the extent that it's even, you know, phenotypically. I look around and I see people like me.
Oh, right. Amazing,
And
right?
it's a curious thing, and
So,
I always feel this, and I feel this way too when I come back to France from spending time abroad. I feel like I don't speak Spanish really. You know, this is all hoax. And it isn't until I have to answer, you know, the customs officials that I realize that, oh yeah, I actually do speak a fair amount of Spanish.
right.
But I get the same feeling with French. You know, I'll be flying back from the States and it's like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to speak French when I get off the plane. And it's like, I've only been here, you know, 20 years, right?
Right. Right. You're like, I'm just, you know, fluent in reading and writing French and like four dialects. I mean, but it's yeah, you know, when you said the phenotypes, absolutely. My wife, the whole time we were in Bucharest, my wife joked that everybody looked like me, and now she understands why I do certain things. Like
Yeah.
she said, like she said that like she's like, I finally understand a lot of your personality quirks after being here in Bucharest because, like, for example, I'm I'm a complete like psychopath when it comes to like eating at restaurants. I always like to eat outside. I don't know, like I've always been like I like to eat
Uh-huh.
outside and I like to have coffee. That's just the two things that like I must have at every restaurant. And my wife's like, that's such a weird thing. And then she went to Bucharest and every place was an outdoor seating cafe.
Sure.
And she's like, "Oh, it's built into you. That's what you like to do because that's what your family probably did growing up. You know, like you guys ate outside all the time, smoking cigarettes and you know drinking espresso." And yeah, I mean that is a thing. It's a cultural thing, and yeah, it's interesting going home. That's a fantastic feeling. I mean, I love South Carolina, but it's not really where I belong. I don't think, but
Yeah.
you know how it is. But what's interesting is that like talking about education, I remember that I think it was my junior year in high school. I took it was like a multicultural or international literature AP class or something like that. And it ended up being kind of dumb, but I really liked the teacher, and she was great. And she came up to me and she's like, "Alex, you're gonna be bored in this class, man. So here, read this book and come back in a month and talk to me about it." And it was The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And I was like, okay, cool. So I went, read books. And I don't know, like, why don't other kids do that? Or why don't, you know, I mean, yeah, I had a lot of friends that did the same thing as me,
Well,
but
she treated you as an adult. She said, "Well, here it's on your responsibility. Go do
right,
this."
right. And that's such missing for, you know, from, you know, the way we do education. But I mean, I can talk about my concepts of like education, homeschool, what we're doing, you know, with my own daughter, you know,
Mm.
that can be like 7 podcasts. I can run an entire like
Sure, sure,
reading
sure,
podcast on
sure.
just that alone. But I find it fascinating because it does, you know, it does kind of like focus on like what we're doing. Like, what are we doing? We're publishing books, we're putting out books. Who's going to read them? Why are they going to read them? And can we build a culture? And that's kind of like maybe
Well,
my hope, right? Is that, look, I'm not going to change the greater culture. I'm not going to be able
well,
to.
yeah, that's right. I mean, when I was at Knopf, and you know, I was Gordon was a fascinating guy to work for a lot of reasons, but he was also he, he, he wasn't easy to understand sometimes. But I got to peek under the hood. He would deliberately try to manufacture trends to varying degrees of success. He quite famously was hired at Esquire magazine, promising to deliver the new fiction. He drove out from California to New York. He's from New York, so and in his interview said he was going to bring the new fiction. And whoever was interviewing him, was it Albert Erskine, or I don't recall, said, "Well, what's that?" He says, "I don't know, but I'll go find it." And I knew that before I ever worked for him. So, I knew that he would try to produce things out of thin air. I'm not trying to do that. I think I don't have the energy or the agility to do a high wire act like that. Also, part of the reason why we only have 7 books in print is that everyone has real jobs. So, for us to be picked up by a distributor, we would have to be putting out about 8 books a year, which is more, that's a full-time job for a single editor. Right. But that you also, I don't, the books come to us in kind of sideways fashion. I mean, every now and then I get an inquiry as to, whether we're open or not. And, I sort of leave it to the, I guess I don't do the inquiry, query letter, this sort of fictitious approach that it's largely writers who've constructed this idea. And it's writers particularly who worked in the 90s for Writer's Digest magazine. They built up this entire superstructure of how to get published and then sold magazines on the basis of their illusions. I don't do any of that. I mean, I sort of want the writer to submit to me who can read between the lines when I say we aren't closed.
Right.
If you can't get it, then that's all right. All right.
And you know what? And that's why I'm such a big supporter of your project. And I think that, listen, like, we can be completely doom and gloom about the whole industry. We can be doom and gloom about the level of literacy in the United States or the world as a whole. But you know what? I love reading and I love writing. Okay.
Well, it gets back to that. And I think the word the important word that you said there is love. I mean, that's really what I look for in a manuscript is the writer in love with what he's writing. Now, I don't mean that. The reason why I have to be so elliptical in the way I speak about this is that if I'm too direct, then I'll be inundated with romance novel manuscripts or something like that. Word gets around, so you have to be a little bit circumspect. But the love is the nerve of voice. It can be a completely rotten voice, but if you don't love it, you simply can't live with it long enough to follow it through to the conclusion of a story of any sort. I'm sorry, I got on.
No, but you're absolutely correct, right? The idea of love and the idea of just a passion for the subject matter, a passion for the art of writing itself. And I will be honest, right? I am very skeptical of a lot of independent publishers. I'm very skeptical of a lot of indie writing because I get it. I get, somebody sends me a book or I purchase a book and I buy everybody's book, right?
Well, I've heard you say that before. And I love that you do that. The energy in the so-called independent scene is wonderful. It's sort of like, getting to see under the hood of a slush pile.
Right.
When I was at Knopf, when you're an assistant to someone, you sort of have to show initiative. You'll never make editor by just filling out profit and loss statements or something like that. So I wanted to be the guy that pulled something from slush. So I read before I showed up. So slush pile got distributed around to all the assistants, and we would have lunch, every other week, and just sort of open envelopes and go through it together, dispiritedly and mockingly.
That sounds awful.
It is, but it isn't. There's a moment where there came a moment where for some reason we couldn't meet, and this enormous backlog got built up, and I decided, well, I'm gonna be the guy. I'm gonna read all of it. I'm gonna pound my way through it. Now, when I say I'm gonna read all of it, do I read every page? Of course not. I'm the first sentence is what I'm going to center my attention on, and so long as you don't do something to offend the English language in that first sentence, I'll probably go on to the second one. But by then, you need to be doing something. And I'm speaking about fiction here, not, I left the nonfiction to my colleagues. You need to be doing something that attracts attention, that makes a fair exchange on my time. That's where a lot of independent writing fails. I think there's a lot, almost all of it is written from love. Some of it is cynical, but
Right.
that's fine. You have to understand that in asking someone to read, the reason why no one reads is because there's so many screens. It's not really that surprising an observation, but
Right.
You're asking them to be focused, which is almost impossible now. Focus enough to have a conversation is too high a hurdle
Right.
for
You're asking
many.
them to put down everything else and come into your world, come into your state of
Right.
mind. And if that's
So,
not worth it, then it's trash.
so if you have problems with pronoun agreement, am I going to persist after that point? No.
Right.
I think the independent, it's really interesting to watch independent writers try to solve this problem of attention. Mostly what they do is they have, well, it's about the object, or I say object for philosophical reasons, but it's about the subject. It's about the conceit. So they have to get the conceit out quickly. And usually they know what kind of book cover they want, right? But it takes a you go beyond the and read the first paragraph or whatever, and it's like, okay, well, when am I going to get to the cool image that's on the book cover? That's where it should begin. Begin at the point of stress. Begin at the highest point of stress. Say something terrible immediately.
Right.
That Say something that puts the reader's heart in their throat. All the good writers do it, whether they're writing literary fiction, that genre, that commercial designation, or whether they're writing genre fiction.
Right.
I,
And
I, I yeah, go ahead.
and I think a lot of independent writers, probably a lot of writers in general, just need to accept that style and voice is the key. All right. If you have a good style and a good voice, I don't care about the plot. And a good example of an independent writer that has a great style and a great voice is Delicious Tacos. All right. Because I can sit down and read, a chapter of him talking about this cat that he had in his house and
Yeah,
his dates, because it's, his voice is very authentic and it's funny and it's also
yeah,
kind of like wistful and sad at the same time.
I,
It's
I,
not
I can make, yeah, I'm a big fan myself too. I can make some pretty educated guesses as to who he read to get that way. Um, I wrote to him a while ago. He made some secondary comment about how, he would be a big deal back in the day, or he was talking about, I think he brought up Carver or something like that. Well, Carver had Gordon Lish in his corner. I wrote to him, I said, man, you really didn't need, Gordon would have messed you up. So it's wonderful to see a writer like that who is clearly aware of what a strong contemporary voice looks like.
right.
And he was unbelievably courageous in spite of, writing behind a pseudonym. I mean, he would be huge if he wrote under his own name. And, this Delicious Tacos is a really interesting dilemma because, I would kill to publish someone who writes that well. But Delicious Tacos doesn't need Pilum.
Right. Right.
He's not going to sell more books. I and my associates could probably. He's a very good stylist, so it's very hard to find a way in edgewise. You don't want to be invasive as an editor either, especially with someone as agile as Tacos.
Right.
But there's, while I would like to build a place where someone who is beginning a project like Tacos, would naturally think of. Even though we're centered mostly on genre fiction, and that's for lots of reasons. Partly because I think genre depends on conceit. It depends on stylish treatment of ridiculous conceits,
Right.
the conceits that literary fiction turns its nose up at. I guess I just got, at a certain point, I don't care about literary fiction anymore. It's become so, it's as insular now as poetry was in the 1990s.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know what? I am writing a novel about my college experience and how I took a year off to go travel through Europe. And oh wait, that's every fucking Barnes and Noble book right now,
Yeah, the auto fiction thing. See, I got out of graduate school before that became something that agents talked about, and it's just awful. It's just awful. It's tennis with the net down. It's all the bad things.
My year as a cashier at Abercrombie and Fitch. That should probably be an interesting book, but to be honest.
Oh boy, yeah, no.
Right? That might be a good one. By the way, I never worked at Abercrombie and Fitch. Okay, I worked at American Eagle. All right. I was hawking jeans. But I don't think actually they'll let me do anything but stand in front and greet people because
for those of you listening at home, you need to understand that Alexandra is extremely, extremely good looking. So
right,
be aware.
Absolutely. Well, I was. Now I'm aged. I read too much Dostoevsky, and I've aged my soul internally.
You're morally shaken now.
Yeah. But no, listen. So, like I said, I'm very critical and of a lot of independent stuff. So this is a story for the listeners. Okay, when you sent me Shagduck, right? That was the first Pilum novel. All right, I've read Sky Hernstrom, and I love Sky Hernstrom. But Shagduck was the first novel, and I was like, okay, let's see what Neal's got. Let's see. I'm curious. It better not be another fucking Conan pastiche or something like that. And I opened that file, and I started reading Shagduck, and I did not put it down. I actually read it. I was sitting in Papua New Guinea, and I was sitting overlooking the Bismarck Sea, and I had the waiters bring me a pack of cigarettes that had 25 cigarettes in them, not 20 like the American ones do. And I sat there, and I think I chain smoked through 2 packs and read the entire novel beginning to end because I loved it. And the reason is because J.B. Jackson obviously loves Texas. You know, the love of Fort Worth and the music and the the scene and the year was just fucking amazing, you know? And that's what what gripped me. And I was like, okay, Neal knows what the fuck he's doing, right? That's how I was like, that's how I
Well,
felt.
no, that's very kind of you to say, but it's more that Jackson knows what he's doing.
Well, you know what you're
Um,
doing by having Jackson write that novel and putting it
well,
out.
a very large, it's hard to explain what editors do. I mean, of course, taste is an important part of that. But I think it's different with every writer. But honesty is important, integrity is important, discretion is very important. Um, I talked earlier about the sort of magic envelope that literary editors enjoyed in the 1990s, which dissipated. Um, that's what you try to build for a writer, and you don't build that for just anyone. Um, Jackson in this book and in the current book, which is crowdfunding on Kickstarter, you should all hop in and get a signed copy while you can.
Right, and I read it
Um,
already, and it's fantastic. So I already threw my money down for the official
but
copies because I've got the galley proof over here on my desk right now. But I want
Jackson writes very cleanly and very carefully. He's been over. Ursula has been through. It's part of an initial book, which was much longer. I forget how many drafts it's been through, but as picky as I am, because I've both been a line editor and a copy editor, and so one of my challenges in doing Pilum efficiently is how to I have a wonderful colleague whom I met in Chicago who is helping us with the copy editing. She's just fantastic. So I can my instinct is to correct everything in every draft, but uh, it's an instinct that you have to curb, um, especially with a writer as clever as Jackson, because he first of all he will see his own mistakes. I can trust him to go back through a markup line by line.
right,
Now, there's something that I think the independent, people who have begun writing, let's just say since the year 2000 and probably before, don't understand. A lot of the books they admire were written on paper. They were typed out on paper, which seems like an obvious thing to say, but imagine doing 5 drafts of a 400-page novel on paper.
right,
It's physically exhausting to do that in a way that working on a computer is not. And that's important because fiction is not an art that exists in time in the same way as music or dance or drama. It sort of exists out of time, but it doesn't really, because what you're doing is you're deploying a series of effects. Uh, we were talking earlier about A Tale of Two Cities, and Dickens deploys a certain number of effects to involve you in the story, but the metaphors he sets up are clearly very deep running. So you have to keep tabs on them yourself. Anyway, there's a constant pressure on the reader's attention in A Tale of Two Cities and in Shagduk and in Ursula of Home.
right.
You
And
can't drop the ball.
right. And during I think in past episodes, the episode I did with JB Jackson himself, and a few of the ones before that, I've constantly mentioned that what is lacking, the critical element that is missing from an independent writing scene right now, and by the independent writing scene I mean our independent writing scene, is the lack of
Mm.
editors and the lack of understanding the importance of editors in the process of writing fiction. Uh, Jackson and I, when we were talking, I think we spent a lot of time comparing editors to producers and studio engineers in recording albums, and I think that's a
Mm,
fantastic way to look at it because sometimes as an author you don't know the parameters of what you can and cannot do,
mm.
and every great author had a great editor behind them to a certain degree.
Yeah, yes and no. Yeah, every great writer had a great reader, not
Yeah,
necessarily an editor, but a great reader, an understander of their someone who is sympathetic to their project. And that's not easy. I mean, I don't hear genre writers talking this way so much. They sometimes talk about their agents in this way, and that's what's happened is that the editorial function has been pushed down to agents now. I say pushed down because that's the aspect the
right.
aspect of dissent is I put editors on a higher level than agents, but that's because I come from old publishing. Nowadays that's not necessarily true, but back in the day there were very few agents who really read very well. They were hired for being good negotiators, and um, I can think the exceptions you can count on two hands.
All right.
If you go back to the 1990s, I don't think I mean, it doesn't seem to me that the situation's improved because just look at the output. And so long as men are not reading fiction, things aren't in good shape.
Right.
That's 49% of readers aren't reading fiction.
So how do
That's
we
got
get men?
to go
How
to
do we
hell.
get men to read fiction?
I don't know. I think any answer would be sort of condescending. Any specific answer. I know what I try to do is, I try to think of my own reading life and, what motive, what I liked, where I departed from genre fiction was in, I guess, 1988, 87 or 88. I took a class, just completely randomly at the University of Texas that happened to be taught by Rick Bass, who's a friend of mine now. And, he, he's a magnificent writer. Um, and through Rick Bass, I learned about a lot of other writers, Barry Hannah in particular. And in both Hannah and Bass, there's this high rambunctiousness that simply wouldn't be published today because it's too hot. It's got
Right.
too many bad words in it.
Right. I mean,
Uh, so
okay.
I
So
think
go ahead.
you have to credit that ram. There are people out there. Mark Lehner is one of them. Um, Chuck Palahniuk is the other. Um, but it's very, very hard to get that. Delicious Tacos. You can mention him in the same sentence with Lehner and Palahniuk.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, there's no reason why that guy shouldn't be. I don't know who's publishing new fiction nowadays. Is it Norton?
Uh,
Uh, it's not. It's not where I used to work. But so, you know, in how do you get men to start reading again? I think that you've got to bring some style and rambunctiousness to the table, and you've got to it's got to achieve something as well. I mean, how many people have read Fight Club?
everybody.
Everybody's read Fight Club.
Right.
Uh, he knows what he's about when it comes to making a sentence. He's one of the few writers I can listen to talk about composition.
Right.
There, I had, graduate school was an utter sham. I had writers who pretended to know about composition, or they hit it back to you entirely. You know, after Elkin died, William Gass took over the workshop. He was pressed into it against his will, and it was quite clear that he was very unhappy about it. William Gass is a very famous writer for having really written a couple of short stories that are just magnificent. One of them is in the heart of the country, which he wrote, I believe, in his 30s. And he consecrated himself to these various pretentious projects toward the end of his career. But when you saw the man, he would sort of look at you disinterestedly and say, "Oh, well, that was a good sentence," and you didn't know whether he was sincere or not. I saw him do that with a lot of colleagues. Then immediately there's a never-ending supply of people who can come in and teach a workshop.
Right.
The fact of work, the worth of a workshop is like the worth of a play. It's based on your presence and attention. It's not necessarily that someone brings the special sauce. Gordon, there's a lot of mystification that attaches to Gordon's teaching, but I think at base, he gave people a terrifying occasion to read. Because Gordon, for whatever else you might say about him, is a very, very strong reader. Watching him mark up manuscripts was just a caution. He would mark at speed, page by page. He could get through a 10-page, short story manuscript in, I don't know, 5 minutes. And you would think, this is a parlor trick. But right. Because I was his assistant and I was responsible for sending these things back to writers, I would sit down and I would actually look at the marks he made. And they're just brilliant.
Right. How great was that era that you lived through, and you had to experience somewhat, with working with somebody like that these independent writers like myself are never going to get. The closest thing I'm ever going to get to that is actually talking to you.
Well, that's kind of there are people out there. I mean to be dismissive of the people who pretended to teach at WashU. It was unbelievably disappointing experience. It was one that I'm sort of angry about still, because it was based on a lot of dishonesty coming from the head of the writing program at the time. It's an angry little man named Eric Pankey who has been writing poetry based on him losing a religion that I wonder if he sincerely believes. It's been going on for years and years. I believe he's at George Mason now. But, had to get that out. I don't know. Maybe that's not necessary. When you say that, I sort of question whether that was just part of the special sauce that New York sells itself on.
Right. I mean, there's a mysticism to it. There's a mystique.
It's sexy. Right? It's sexy as hell.
Right. I listened to the Bret Easton Ellis podcast, and he talks his latest episode. He talked how different his most recent tour was compared to tours, for his books in the past, in the 90s, where he got the unlimited credit card and he got whatever he wanted and everything was paid for. And now it's like,
now he's sitting in the, adjacent to the children's section in a Barnes and Noble in Des Moines. And
right. I don't think he even
someone announces his name on the intercom.
Yeah, I don't think he even does United States tours anymore, because he only did it in Europe, because he thinks that, I guess Europeans still have somewhat interesting literary aspirations to read.
Oh, the culture in France is off the charts. France, right. Argentina, it's like going back in time.
Right. And I think that there's a fantasy of the 90s or late 80s literary scene in New York where, you get a 6-figure, up front, and then all the free cocaine you can snort, and you're at parties all over Manhattan.
Well, Brett would know, wouldn't he?
Right.
he yeah, he's funny because I was in high school when Lesson Zero came out, and like everyone else, I was writing my little things in my AP class and whatnot, and my buddy who now runs he's the chair of an English department at a very important private school in Virginia. Anyway, he pressed it on me. He said, "Yeah, you got to read this guy." And I think it was the first thing I had read in present tense. Or am I thinking of Bright Lights, Big Cities in present tense? I believe Lesson Zero is in
I
present.
think Lesson Zero is, yeah, I think it is.
But anyway, I was like, this guy is. I think he was 19 when it was published or something
Yeah,
like that. What a terrible thing to have happen to you. Have your
horrible,
book published at 19.
horrible.
But I mean, he's someone he has really hung in there, and you know, I'm a fan of his podcast too. Only I don't have a paid subscription, so you have to describe to me what
Right.
went on. So yeah, so yeah, that's true. Back then, book tours were really a big deal. People in marketing, there were some terrible people in marketing back then. They were unbelievable. They were the worst non-readers that that can exist. Their their presence is actually a negative for selling books. Um, you know, I particularly the marketing people at Knopf were just unbelievably up their own asses, and just I saw. I'm telling tales out of school because I just absolutely do not care who I piss off anymore.
Well, that's why
Um,
I like you.
there there was a very she still is a very famous daily talk show host who was going to bring out a her autobiography, and of course, that is a slam dunk. That's millions of dollars on the table,
Right.
and the she was a publisher and director of marketing, Jane Friedman. She's still out there. She's consulting people on how to be satisfied with less and less from Amazon. Um, that's how she makes her money now.
I was about to joke that all those people probably work at Amazon now.
Well, no, she's worse. She's a freelancer, but she's still an apologist for Amazon. She's so dishonest that even though she doesn't work directly for them, she still lies to improve Amazon's dominant market position. It's just astounding. These people are very interested in power. That's what really gets them off. Anyway, they were trying to reel in this autobiography, and they were so falling over themselves. They planned this enormous tour, and they would have these big meetings. Go right by my desk. I would see everyone going in there, and I could overhear the meeting. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to fly you here, we're going to fly you there. And the very famous, important person, even though she was in the spotlight every day and has been for 30 years, got cold feet. She said, "These people are crazy." That's how insane they were.
That's
No,
wild.
the idea back then was synergy. We want Hollywood to get involved. And so the minute you say the word Hollywood, everyone starts acting like a movie producer.
Right.
At the same time, at Knopf, Knopf had an editor emeritus, a fellow named William Koshland, wonderful, wonderful man who had been there with Alfred and Blanche at the start. I believe Bill must have died in the late 90s, probably. But he was old guard Knopf and old guard New York Publishing. Polite to everyone, considerate, smart, and would only be brought in on questions that were too difficult questions about acquisitions among competitive agents or whatever. And he was just someone I watched. It was interesting to see him behave. He was so circumspect while this ridiculous whirl of pretension was going on at the same time. So it was an odd place, for someone in their early 20s. It was like, to whom do I attach myself? It's like,
Right.
eventually I just, it's like,
Detached.
I'm a state college kid from Texas. There's no place for me here. I mean, that I was ejected basically because I was not Ivy League. And, I was only ever hired at Gordon's insistence. So that's not a good place to to begin. But yeah.
It is what it is, right?
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I want to actually change topics real fast. Not topics. I want to move away from the business side, which I find fascinating. Like I said, I think that what we've been talking about is going to be so interesting to a lot of people that listen to this podcast because they're not familiar with this kind of like inside ball from back in the day. And then some people might be. But I want to talk about you real fast. You're obviously a reader, okay? What You're a reader, you're a writer yourself, you're an editor. Why? Where did that come from? Did you grow up reading? What authors, what novels, brought you, made you go, you know what? I want to be a writer. I want to be in the industry. What brought you into it?
Oh, in the industry. I don't know. When I was a kid, I used to make little books, in school to draw to get patted on the head or, to please my mother or something like that. I've always been interested in the physical aspect of a book and what that means, that you're producing this physical object that's going to live longer than you. And that it seems like an incredibly fraught act that ought to be done correctly. So, there's that kind of, yeah, so I don't even know what my little books were about. I knew I needed to have a story, so I would knock something together and illustrate it. Actually writing, I don't know. I read the same genre fiction that pretty much everyone my age read when I was coming up. And I was that sort of reader that buys, just has to have a book and, to calm down and to be centered. And I was this was back when Walden Books at the shopping mall was a thing. I don't know if that was still a thing when you were a kid.
I remember B. Dalton's in shopping malls and Walden Books.
Yeah, same sort of thing.
I think I used to shop from there.
Oh, now I couldn't possibly ever say anything about that myself. But I got very, very curious about what other sorts of books there were out there. And I had one smart friend at school who was, I don't know, we were 14, 15 or something, who had started reading philosophy. And I got very interested in that. I was like, I don't understand a single sentence in this book. I've got to buy it. Right. So that I bought a Penguin portable Nietzsche when I was 14 or 15, threw that in my backpack. And, it wasn't any idea in it in particular until I got to the aphorisms. And then I could, the aphorisms are easy to ingest. It's exactly what Nietzsche intended. But I was just so curious about how that language went together. So then, later on in high school, I think I for some reason, I took a strange liking to Stephen Crane. The Red Badge of Courage was my favorite book for a long time.
It's a great book.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I haven't read it in a few years. I should go back and do so. And so I don't know. I had one teacher who sort of encouraged me, and we had creative tasks we had to do, and I sort of began to see that there was a lot of the margins around the hamburger essay are wide and wonderful. And when do you know what I mean by hamburger essay? It's an essay that says what you're going to say, and then you say 3 points, and then you say what you said.
Right. The 5-paragraph essay, I think we call it.
That's exactly it. That's right. So I by the time I was at university, I was just really in love with coloring outside the lines, but not just coloring outside the lines, coloring everything outside the lines. So I wrote some very weird papers. I was a philosophy student, so that kind of goes with the territory. I think it was appreciated. They gave me a degree anyway. And then I at the time, in terms of fiction, I took some shots at science fiction. I had read most of Philip Dick by then, and like a lot of people, that's a common that's common coin with people like me, I think.
Right. There seems to be a resurgence of Philip K. Dick love recently, from at least from the internet. What I'm noticing.
Oh well. I mean, almost. I imagine that almost all of his work has been optioned for film. I mean, it's crazy. There's lots to say about him. I don't. We've talked too much about literary fiction. I mean, I like genre fiction because of how much freedom you really have. Your readers are not demanding in the same way that snobby, prestige interested readers on the literary side of things are interested. You're not going to be a hit in Brooklyn, but that was never a question. It's like, what would Gene Wolfe care whether or not he's read in Brooklyn?
Right. I mean, Gene Wolfe probably never got invited to the cocaine parties.
No, of course not.
Maybe J.G. Ballard, though.
Ballard for sure.
Right.
But Ballard for sure. But I mean, there's a kind of looseness that attaches to writers who are firmly planted in genre. And Ballard's a wonderful. I should have brought him up earlier. That there's something about particularly British writing that I think. And Gordon was part of the problem, part of the reason why American aesthetics turned toward the sheerly modern and away from what I like to call British middle style. It's not high style. It's like, delicious tacos, whether he likes it or not, that's high style.
Right.
There's the style that he selects contains meaning. Ballard there's a little bit of that, especially in his short fiction and his earlier books, but it's mostly, traditional narrative. There are scenes in it, there are dramatic beats, there are procedural beats. We've lost that in the United States. Only genre writers have never lost that. Literary fiction has lost that. It's not cool anymore. But where did literary fiction go? To autofiction?
Right.
Good job.
Memoir, fake memoirs, and that kind of stuff.
So, I took a course with Rick Bass, and we remained in correspondence. And after I graduated, I was serious about becoming a writer. I wanted very much to be published in Gordon's magazine called The Quarterly, and worked very hard to get in there, and did. The first story he saw of mine, he wrote me back on the Knopf letterhead saying, that this wonderful letter soliciting me for a novel. And I must have been all of 22. I can remember sitting down on the front step of the porch, the house I was living in, and thinking, well, there it is. That was your break. You don't have a book.
Oh, shit.
It's like, happened too early.
Should have waited on that one.
Yeah. Well, so that's a bit, that's what got me going to New York. I mean, which was a silly thing to do. I think, in hindsight, it would have been, you know, I couldn't have, even then, Austin was unlivable, but I should have packed it back up to Fort Worth and done my thing there. Um, but we all know about hindsight.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think you're right, and I think for the purposes of the listeners here, your concept of middle middle style, middle fiction, it's something that you and I have talked about in the past, like
Mm.
specifically about like John Fowles,
Mm.
who I love. I love his novels, where it's not the low grade fiction of the pulps, but it's not the literary high style of something like Virginia Woolf. That's like
Mm.
that would be a good example, I think, of high style.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Or Proust, maybe, if you want to go back in time a
Mm.
bit. Um,
Sure.
but I think what middle level fiction, middle style, is what most people think of when they think about a novel,
Mm.
and it is missing from literary fiction right now, and you can find that in genre, like in science fiction, and
Mhm.
also in a lot of like crime stuff. Um, I mean, what would you consider like Thomas Pynchon's Inherent Vice?
I have problems with Pynchon. I
Well,
have problems
I
with,
do too. There's a lot of superfluous stuff, but that's a novel that kind of fits in the middle.
yeah, yeah. Hmm. I don't know. Pynchon just vexes me, so I have a hard time. I'll get over it one of these. Maybe after we finish this conversation, I'll go back to him because I don't think I can say anything. My answer to any question about Pynchon is just this: Don DeLillo.
Okay, so where would you place him? Middle,
DeLillo?
high?
DeLillo is in the middle.
Okay,
He can write very sheer high style when he wants to. He can go in and out. He can go in and out. He's a magnificent writer, just spellbinding.
all right. I
Um,
didn't, the only DeLillo I've read was White Noise. I didn't love it, but I definitely loved
mm,
the writing.
yeah,
Um,
he's always a good return on time. I never feel like I've wasted my time in reading him. I, that may be why I don't like Pynchon as much as I might. Um, I don't know. I mean, I'm getting to the age where I don't really want to go down any rabbit holes that aren't, going to be resolved.
right.
Um,
You don't want to read Gravity's Rainbow again?
I don't think I've ever read it in its entirety, but no, I'm not. I'm cured of books like Gravity's Rainbow. I'm completely cured of it. I don't. I'm always reminded of John Updike's comment about Infinite Jest. He said this must have been, when did that come out? Maybe 97 or something like that. He said, if you can't say something in 400 pages, why?
Right.
He engaged with it more than that, but that was what I retained from Updike's review of Infinite Jest.
Right.
There's something, I don't know. There's something impacted and uninteresting and fetid about uh, Wallace's work that
I mean,
I just.
I'm not a fan, so we are on the same team on that one. I don't like the affectation of kind of dripping with irony, and there's just a level of fakeness to it that
Mm,
I just can't stand. And it's not
mm.
even the weird kind of pseudo sci-fi elements of it, because that kind of stuff is better. It just feels like, I don't know, a Family Guy version of a novel.
That's funny.
It's that sort of thing. I don't know what it is. I mean, at the same time, I liked some of the, I mean, talking about, you live in France, and right now the big French guy, Mr. Michel Houellebecq,
Mm.
His stuff is out there, but
I've been avoiding Welbeck. Um, I've been avoiding him because I'm concerned about the effect that he'll have on me.
oh, I mean, it's
Um,
completely depressing stuff.
well, he's writing about where I live, and he's writing very from what I hear from critiques. Yeah, I mean I'm a reader, but that goes both ways. Um, I don't read Joyce or Cormac McCarthy just willy-nilly, because those two writers have such a profound effect on the way I hear language for a long time. And I don't necessarily welcome it. It's not easy, this reading thing.
Right,
I mean, it's
absolutely.
not about consuming something and then saying, yay, reading. You're
Absolutely.
letting someone into your house, and their stink can they come in and they smoke 25 cigarettes on your
Well,
couch.
that's probably Welbeck for sure.
Yeah, so
And
I don't
he
really.
leaves pornography on your DVD player, and you're
For
like,
sure, right? It leaves
fuck,
it
man.
inside of my son.
Yeah,
Alex, I think probably the most honest thing that anyone can say about a book nowadays is that they haven't read it.
right. That's a good point, right? You know, I have if I had one critique of Welbeck, and I think I've read all his novels, is that he is kind of in the vein of J.G. Ballard, if J.G. Ballard
Mm,
mixed with Celine. That might be the French thing, but I think he's a nymphomaniac. He's obsessed with sex and
mm.
women, and I just don't like women that much. That's my like a lot of his novels are about the existential dread of getting older and not being able to sleep with women, which is
Mm.
not an issue I have, because the idea of getting older and not being able to sleep with women sounds fantastic to me. So it's like, I'm like, okay, dude, I get it, but they're not that
Well,
great.
see what I was saying earlier about New York being sexy, and that whole scene. It turns on that kind of allure. Um, maybe it's just that I'm very happily married, and very stuck into family life. I know that there's just some, especially if it's conducted by a competent writer, which Welbeck gives every indication of being. I guess I'm just not willing to go down that path right now.
Right. I mean, there are novels that are masterpieces that you read and you feel
Mm,
like gross when you're done. And Journey to the End of the Night is one of them, where I was like, God, I
yeah, 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 yeah.
fucking hate the universe after reading this novel.
Yeah,
It's
that's
so
that's
it's
the
so
first
bleak.
book I read in that's the first book I read in French, where,
It's
where I
such a
really
difficult,
committed and I bore down and read through it.
right?
Um,
I read it in English, and it just like I was like, I want this novel to be over because it is
mm,
so fucking bleak.
I
And
could never go through there. There's the suburb north of Paris, Corancy, which
right,
is where his protagonist is a doctor for a while, and I always get a little shiver when I go by that way.
right,
Um,
it's like it's stuck with me, and
yeah,
it's
yeah.
just like it's a you know I mean, this is a guy who was such he had such a bleak outlook in life, and he was such a nihilist, and I mean he was
Mm.
eh, you know Nazis thought he was too much of a Nazi.
Well,
Like they're like,
you need to know why you're engaging with someone
right,
as a reader too. And for me, I knew I had to read Celine for stylistic reasons.
right,
He
absolutely.
has this wonderful way of writing uh, these self-negating sequences it's just breathtaking. It's just wonderful, and it's not peculiar to French. It comes through in English as well.
It absolutely does. Like the carnival scene, the parade scene in that novel is just
The parade scene. Oh my God, the parade scene.
right.
It that I was working for the French army at the time, and I felt it. The parade goes by and they just fall in line.
Right.
It's just astounding.
It's wonderful. I mean, he is, I think, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century,
Mm.
without a doubt, in my mind. And but yeah, he's not easy to read. He's not fun to read at all. It's not something that I want to do on a beautiful sunny South Carolina afternoon. Right.
For
And
sure.
so I want to take it back to Pilum because we're doing this
Yeah.
because we love books, right? We love books and we love talking about books. What what kind of writing are you looking for? What do you want from authors? Because I like obviously if I'm a independent writer or a writer myself and I want to get involved with an independent publisher like you, looking at Shagduck, that's fantastic. Like my writing is very similar to I would say the vibe of Shagduck. But what kind of what are you looking for?
Well, it's written on the tin. I say Pilum Press is about savage spectacle from unexpected quarters, arrayed in outlandish guises, reestablishing wonder in tired ears, eyes, and hearts. I read that off the screen.
Okay, that's wonderful.
Um, uh, the first thing, this is what I said earlier when I was reading Slush for Knopf. Commit no offense, grammatical or syntactical, and engage with risk immediately and the heart, and you'll get there. That's how you get voice. Um, Voice is what pulls the ear through the entire story. Fiction is it's written, but it's oral at the base. I mean, at base, we're all sitting around a campfire and someone decides to fill up the silence with something.
Right.
And it could just be stupid. It could be a fart, you know. But if it's a story, then it's got to come from somewhere. Um, what's wonderful about voice, when you read someone who's particularly gifted, and we were talking about middle stylists, and I just finished rereading all of Graham Greene. Um, Greene establishes voice immediately. There, even if he's writing in the third person, when you're beginning and you first discover the power of writing in voice, you often write in the first person. That's wonderful. When you get better, you realize it can be done in the third person, and there's sort of this very mysterious terrain opens up. So voice has to be present. Risk has to be present. Jeopardy has to be present, maybe is a better word. I don't want expository language. I don't want sentences which begin with dependent clauses. The easy way to get through to what I want to see is to pick up one of our anthologies and see what's going on in there. They're not perfect, but they're good enough to put in, to warrant existence.
Right.
What we're trying to do with those anthologies is to give a place for writers who are on that wavelength to go. We're just trying to be an attractor for that. I'm working with one writer we published in our last anthology called Deathflex, Charles Crabtree, who has these wonderful, this wonderful fabulist voice, which takes him to interesting places. And I've accepted a story of his for our upcoming anthology, which is called Prizes. I suspect now it won't be published until the fall. And I'm hoping that he'll see what I see in it and write a novel. I was saying earlier that reading is a two-way street, that you don't necessarily want to let anyone drive down. So for whatever reason, I haven't read Welbeck right now, but editing is even more fraught than reading. I'll for Charles's story, I sort of we've talked about it a bit, and I hope he doesn't mind me talking about it here. And I've sort of sketched out a kind of terrain I would like to see him inhabit. Now, if he thinks about it and says, "Well, I can't do it," or he does something else, great. I want my expectations upset. I don't. When in editing Jackson, he worked very, very hard to bring in the beats that he brings in Ursula of Ulm. There is the middle part of the book that was delivered to me had some problems that were there was nothing you could isolate and say, you've got to lose this. There was a rhythmical problem with the middle of the book. And, my job was to, like I'm laboring to do now, express what that is, how it could look, and give the writer some idea about how to go about fixing it. But I'm not going to do what my former boss used to do, which he would go in and he would fix it. I decided early on that I was not going to do that, and it's so gratifying when you work with a writer. You give them an idea, and they invariably come back with something better that you didn't think of. And I can't think of any greater experience as a reader than that. It's just sublime. It's like,
that sounds wonderful.
Jackson, you hit it out of the park. Thank you. Thank you. You got it. You got it, man. So with luck, it may be Charles we're not the only girl at the dance, so he's got other editors interested in his work. I hope that, he goes into that story and sees what I see or maybe finds something different. So that's what we're trying to do with the anthologies. I expect that novels will come out of some of the stories that have appeared there. I talked with Lester Glover recently, and he thought there might be another chapter to his story. His title is escaping me at the moment. Also, Brian Renninger is still thinking about his story in Deathflex. So I expect Brian Renninger will have a novel in the next year or so.
I actually really enjoy his writing a lot.
He's someone who's changed considerably since we first published him. He's a fantastic reader himself. He's read everything in genre. He's the perfect sort of correspondent for me. I'm years out of, geographically and temporally displaced from whatever's going on now. But he's read everything that I need to read. I can very often just ask him what I should read, or what do you think of this, and he'll just tell me.
Talking to him, I'm always like surprised by how much he's read. He's read everything and some. I'm like, okay, do you do anything else but read? And he does. He's like an adventurer. All right, so keeping up on literature, Neal. Let's imagine that like I was your student. What novels would you, as the Pilum Press editor, recommend I read? Like, give me like one or two novels that you think are like foundational in teaching me like the vibe of the style that you like.
Oh man, you're really putting me on the spot. With respect to genre, or just
your choice. It's like I'm a young male. I'm 25 years old, right? And this is something that happened to me recently, right? And I come up to you and they go, "Hey, Neal, you're into books and stuff. What should I read? What should I read?"
Yeah, well, I don't know, and stuff. But I go back to my recent reading, and well, There's a book. I was just about to say Graham Greene's Brighton Rock, um, which is just a wonderful early novel of his that's a just the perfect mixture of style and drama. It's just wonderfully executed. But I just thought of another book um, that was written by Geoffrey Household in 1939 called Rogue Male. It's just a wonderful title. Um, it couldn't be more pulp. It's not a pulp book. Um, Rogue Male is really a fantastic book that was, I had no idea about Geoffrey Household. I'm very interested in right now for whatever reasons in what was written between the world wars. So Celine would certainly fit
Right,
in
he'd fit
there.
into
I
that.
wouldn't suggest that you read Celine
Right,
if you're.
not to somebody that's never read anything else.
No, I think Rogue Male is there. There's a lot of very good understatement in it. Earlier I said that I think what's missing in male fiction is rambunctiousness. I sometimes correspond on Twitter with an Iowa writing program graduate who's about your age, or perhaps even younger, a fellow named Alex Perez who has the right idea. He understands that things have become too stuffy and identitarian.
Right, he
You know,
does. He's a great article writer. I've never read any of his fiction, but his
mm-hmm.
articles are wonderful.
But he values chaos. um, so there's a book I'm about to reread called The Tennis Handsome by Barry Hannah, which is just a hoot. That it depends on why you're asking me. If you're saying, well, what sort of style are you after? Um, I would put Household on one pole and maybe Hannah on the other. But for people who are interested in writing in writing genre, I think that Gene Wolfe's Fifth Head of Cerberus is fantastic. I think one of I wrote a bunch of stuff when I was putting together Pilum, and I sent it around to people, trying to articulate what we were going to do. And one of the things that came up was I wanted to try, if only virtually, to recreate some of the freedom of literary Buenos Aires and from the 20s through the 50s, where Borges was writing detective novels with Bui Casares. And people were putting together one issue surrealist journals. And it was just this wonderful time when it just mattered that you got to your typewriter and put out pages.
And just did it.
They weren't trying to create literature that would stand for the ages. I think we could do with something that's a bit dashed off, to tell you the truth. So I'm trying to think of something that's dashed off, which is certainly not Gene Wolfe.
Right.
Can you think of something dashed off and charming?
Well, I have very peculiar taste, okay? So when I had a 25-year-old come up to me and it was like, "Hey Alex, you read a lot, you write about reading, you write, you have a podcast. What should I read?" And I go, "Well, what kind of shit do you like? What are you into?" And right away I think about, most of that generation, the Zoomer generation, is a film generation, is a movie or TV show generation.
Ah,
And the one book that he wanted something more literary. He wanted something a little bit like above the usual like Stephen King, Harry Potter type stuff.
oh,
And I
okay.
was like, you know what? No Country for Old Men.
Yeah, it's sure.
And the reason I my thought process for No Country for Old Men was that it's very masculine, it's very
Mhm.
straightforward, even though there is a lot of metaphors and biblical allusions to it. But it was written as a screenplay, so
Right.
it
Yeah.
reads cinematic, which is
It's plot,
technically
it's plotted,
right.
even
It's
though the plot is not resolved, which is the
right.
whole point of the thing. But yeah, that's a good recommendation. That's a very good recommendation. It's
Even though,
rambunctious, that's for sure.
yeah, my big complaint with Cormac McCarthy, which I love Cormac McCarthy, but if I had one thing that keeps him from being in my favorite pantheon of writers, is that he's an all external writer. There's very little internality in his work, which I don't like. I want I want to be inside my characters, not above them. Um,
Mm.
his older stuff tends to be a little bit more internal stuff, like what's the one I just read last year, a Suttree, for example. But after that, it's all external. It's all your third person viewing.
Mm.
All right, so yeah, that's a good thing. I mean, and then there's Thomas McGuane. You can always give him 92 in the shade.
Yeah, Tom McGuane. Yeah, I think I talked with Alex Perez about that. He's the kind of writer who disappeared, but when I began writing, he was still around, and I sure did admire him. There was a place for that kind of voice in the United States. Rural or semi-rural, um, and it's something I identified with. But that's all gone. I guess it comes back every now and then as a simulacrum of that, but there's no sizzle to it. It's all execution of tropes. It doesn't. It's not authentic.
Right.
So you think about when 92 in the Shade was written, you have Sam Shepard writing and producing plays. And now what have we got?
Right, nothing. I mean, even the film industry is completely dull right now. There's not much.
Oh, especially the film industry is dull. Especially the film
Right.
industry is
There's
dull.
nothing exciting going on in that realm either. I mean,
It's
what are we gonna do? I want to walk into Barnes and Noble, and I want to like I want to be like, God, there's so much stuff I want to buy. Right now, like I feel like I have to go in there and like look under the desk or something like that to find something
Oh,
remotely.
I immediately abandoned bookstores once Amazon came around. I
Right.
guess I was still in St. Louis. I was working in a library then, so I mean that's completely obscene that I would do that. But going to a bookstore, part of it was that it was St. Louis and not New York. There are bookstores in New York, or there used to be, where you could certainly find whatever obscure title you were looking for, particularly for poetry. Um, but going to it was a fool's errand. It's just like, well, no, we don't have it. Well, I can order it. Yeah, I can order it too.
Right.
Um, it's a bad.
And save me some gas. It's funny because it's funny you say this because I think 2 days ago I posted a picture on Substack notes about a Amazon delivery I got with the 4 books, and somebody commented, kind of snarky, kind of attacking me a little bit about like, oh, why do I support Amazon and blah blah blah. And I'm like, you know what? I do want to support local bookstores, but there isn't going to be these books you're not going to find in a local bookstore. Okay, if I wanted like Where the Crawdad Sings, I can go pick it up at the local bookstore. Right, but I can't. I'm not going to get Byung Chul Han novels. I mean, philosophy books at any
Yeah.
local bookstore. Okay, I'm not going
So,
to
so you
get
think about that. When I was 14 and I was looking for a book to read, and I picked up the Portable Nietzsche, in a crappy Walden Books in Fort Worth, Texas. You couldn't do that now.
no.
It's
I
not
mean,
there.
it's you might find it over at Barnes and Noble, but it's just you know you're not going to find anything new and interesting. You look at the new release stuff, and it's all. I think I did a kind of a survey of it a few years ago where I went in and I looked at every single book that was on the new Barnes and Noble shelf, and out of the entire shelf, there was zero male, like white male writers. Under 50.
So you see why I don't have any regrets about not staying in publishing or going on to teaching at a university.
Right. It just, there's nothing for us there, you know? And then when you ask the questions like, why don't guys read? Well, what am I going to read? The internal memoirs of a New York college guy, you know?
Well, no, I mean that it's such a narrowing. I mean, I can name lots of. It's not like I read exclusively male writers coming up. I mean,
Right.
uh, your previous guest delighted me. I believe that was Caleb Codell.
Cordell, yeah.
He delighted me when he said, so being from the Midwest, he had read Sherwood Anderson. I mean, that should be a layup. That should be just a given. But things are so dire now that, I hear that someone reads and appreciates Winesburg, Ohio. I'm like, yeah, man, go for it.
Right.
But when I was saddened not to hear Willa Cather's name. But some of the foremost American stylists since the war are female, of course.
Flannery O'Connor.
Flannery O'Connor, Grace Paley, Eudora Welty, Joan Didion, Amy Hempel, Dawn Raffel. Who else? I'm forgetting people. Jane Ann Phillips. Elizabeth Hardwick. These are all names that people habitually bring up, but for some reason, the idea that women are underrepresented as in literary fiction is somehow au courant.
Right.
It's insane to me. It's just insane to me. Everyone I just named has been an influence on me.
Right.
Particularly Amy Hempel.
I have a feeling that Flannery O'Connor is going to get a little bit spotlight right in the next few months because there's a movie coming out.
Right, we're going to rake her over the coals for.
Well,
for
so I'm actually kind of optimistic about the movie. It was written and it's done, and Flannery O'Connor is being played by Uma Thurman's daughter. What's her name? I forgot. She's the one from Stranger Things, and she was in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Okay.
Mia, it's Mia something.
It's okay.
Whatever, right? But I saw an interview with her and her dad, and who's also in the movie. He's like the producer for the movie, and there seems to be a lot of love for her writing and her herself. So it seems like a project of people
I hope so.
really appreciate the writing. So it's interesting. I'm kind of interested in seeing that movie, and I live next door to Savannah, next door to her birthplace.
She's from Milledgeville,
right? But she went to school here in Savannah, and there's the house where I think she was a child and a teenager before she moved back to Milledgeville, and I'm in the South, so I have to like Flannery O'Connor, right?
Well, no, you don't have to, but you'd be a fool not to.
Right, absolutely.
The power of her intellect is, again, she's one of those writers that I reread only at the right time. I approach her with trepidation. She's very, very strong.
Right.
Not to be fooled with.
Right.
All.
Definitely. All right, Neal, we've been talking for over 2 hours, I think, which is fantastic, man. Like, it was wonderful. And what I really care about right now, everybody that's listening, this was a wonderful conversation. Neal is a fantastic resource. Make sure you follow Pilum Press on Twitter, X now, I guess, right? And go ahead and go to the Pilum Press website and pick up Shagduck. Pick up Sky Hernstrom stuff put out by Pilum because it's fantastic. Pick out the anthologies of the new writers Pilum puts out because they're wonderful. And right now, if you're listening to this today, hop on the Kickstarter and support Pilum Press's next novel, the sequel to Shagduck. I recommend that if you have not read Shagduck, you choose the option of the Kickstarter that gives you Shagduck and Ursula Ulm. And I'm not the kind of guy that sings a lot of praises to novels, but Shagduck is fantastic. And I recently read The Galley for Ursula, and I loved it. And I can't wait for the next book by J.B. Jackson. And I can't wait for the next novel put out by Pilum and edited by Neal because he's wonderful. So please do that. All right, Neal, thank you so much for being on today. Thank you for giving me your time. I know, we live on 2 different continents, so it was a pleasure having you, and you're always welcome back. So the invitation is open indefinitely for the time being, right? And for listeners, please remember to follow, like, share, and discuss today's episode across as many platforms as possible. Good afternoon, good night, or something. I don't know, whatever. I'll see you guys next time.
Thank you, Alex.
All right, Neal, we are done.